So yeah, it looks like we're right about at 3 minutes past the hour. Ready to get started, Phil?
Absolutely. Let's do this.
Let's go. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Expr 2 Bootcamp Session 2. Hopefully you guys were able to see Session 1, but we'll be going into some more advanced things today. First, we'll start with the introduction and some housekeeping rules. Then I'll hand it over. So yeah, normal webinar rules apply. Your microphones are muted. We do have a QA feature. We would definitely encourage you to submit questions. We definitely got a lot of questions last time. Looking forward to getting a lot more today. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Some of them live, some of them in text. But we'll do our best. If we do get too many questions, so we can't answer them all, we will send a follow-up to try to answer all of them. But we'll definitely get all the questions, just maybe not by the end of the session today. And we are being recorded, so we will definitely send the recording afterwards. So yeah, today let me introduce Phil. He's our lead solutions engineer and definitely an expert, which could be a little bit of a mouthful to say. And a big fan of both cats and lacrosse. So in the effort of getting your expert questions answered as fast as possible, I highly recommend you send Phil a picture of a cat playing lacrosse just to get the fastest response possible. But yeah, let's delve into what our audience is doing today and start with a little bit of a poll. So can you guys tell us how comfortable you are with formulas? Oh, sorry, I did not launch the poll. There we go. I have now launched the poll. Little technical snafu there, but
All right. Every time I try and submit to the poll, it doesn't like that.
You're not allowed.
All right. No one cares what my answer is anyway.
All right. Well, it looks like almost everyone has replied. I'll give a couple more seconds for those stragglers to answer. But yeah, we've got a lot of participation here. It looks like we've got a very small number of people who are very comfortable with Expr. And it looks like most people, a little bit less than half, did watch the last session. So I think most people are in the right place. And it looks like we've only got a couple people who have never used formulas. So so it sounds like we've got a pretty moderately experienced group here. So sounds like the right crowd. But yeah, take it away, Phil.
All right. Thank you, Nick. Welcome, everyone. As Nick already mentioned, this is session 2 of our little bootcamp series. My colleague Julia gave a session a week ago. I highly encourage you to look at that one if you're one of the people that hasn't yet looked at it, or maybe if you want a refresher, it's available so you can go rewatch it. We're going to build on some of the things you've seen and heard then. And then next week, we'll also have an expert hour. So we're going to have a Q&A session where we'll do both live answering questions and answers without any scripted preamble. And we might take the opportunity, if we see a lot of Q&A questions coming in that clearly mean we haven't covered them correctly, or we think they might be useful to everybody else, we might do a short, short little presentation to show you those answers while you guys come in and type your own. But let's talk about today first. We're going to be covering 5 topics in relatively quick succession. We'll talk about some of the basic improvements in Expr 2.0, so what's come out since 7.0 of structures launched. Then we're going to go into user functions, which is just a great way for you guys to write your own Expr functions that you can keep referencing. We're going to talk about items and properties, which is one of the coolest features, I think, in Expr, is the fact that we now have access to a lot more data than we did before. So instead of just pulling in things like sprints, we can now also get the sprint start date. But I'll show you all of that in a minute. And then we're going to talk about arrays at the end. So arrays is a data structure on how we can get some more data now, and then we're going to start manipulating them. The basic improvement sections are slides. Everything else is going to be done live with examples. So hopefully you can see both the formulas being created and written, and at the same time, if I mess something up, you'll see me fixing it, or hopefully fixing it, so that you guys can see also just, A, that's normal, but B, also where all the various resources are that you'll need. So without any further ado, let's talk about the basic improvements that we've made. This section really covers functionality that existed before in terms of you could do this, but it's now easier and better. So we'll start with the if expression. Just like in Expr 1, you would write a conditional statement with if, you'd have whatever the condition is, then separated by a semicolon, you would have whatever the result is that you wanted. And you could chain these together, obviously, keep adding more semicolons for each condition. With Expr 2.0 now, you can just write if, you don't have to write any brackets, and then you'd use the colon to indicate what you want to happen afterwards. So we've added the else keyword, and as you might expect, for those of you with some programming experience, else if is also an option. So now instead of having everything tied between these parentheses, you can now have each condition and operation on a separate line, just to make it a little bit more readable, a little bit easier to maintain as you kind of update things or review formulas that you've created in the past. Another thing that we've added or improved, should I say, is the concat operation and just the ability to work with strings. So previously, if you wanted to add a new format to the output of your formula, you would have to concatenate the variables and the piece of text that you have, right? So you would have status, open bracket, status category, close bracket. All these things have to be added to the concat formula. The concat function. And this could get quite cumbersome, especially for larger pieces of text that you wanted to incorporate or larger expressions. So now what we can do is we can use the triple quotes. We can create a bit of text, and then using the $, you can start to impute different both variables as well as whole expressions. If you add, everyone calls them curly brackets, but I like to call them mustache brackets. And so this makes it a little bit easier because you don't have to constantly be doing, another semicolon and then another double quotes and then another semicolon just to add little bits of it. This works for multi-line syntax as well. So these triple quotes allow you to just nest a whole chunk of text, and then you can add the variables using the $, or the expressions. As I mentioned, the concat operator had a bit of not really a facelift, call it extra functionality added to it. So like I said before, it's a function. Now it's also an operator. So what that means is that you can actually just nest an expression in between two keywords concat, and then it will put it in between those. It just makes things a little bit easier. I'll show you an example of this towards the end, but it just makes formulas easier to read and therefore easier to maintain, less prone to bugs, which I'm hoping we can all agree is an ideal. Finally, one of the things that's going to be used a lot today, so I want to spend a little time talking about it, is the dot function call. So previously, if we had a bit of data we wanted to operate on, we would have to basically wrap it in whatever formula we wanted to use or function. So if we have, say, date subtract, we'd have to put in the variables inside it. And then if we wanted to add another, say, date format to it, we would have to wrap the entire expression here, date subtract, date add, created, etc., in the date format function. And that becomes quite cumbersome very quickly, especially once you want to add 2 or 3 or more. And so now what we can do is we can chain these, as you can see in the example at the top, using the dot function. So you could have, created, date added, date subtract, and then within each parentheses, keep the operations contained. And it just makes a little bit more sense because you can see the operation working obviously in series. You don't have to start thinking kind of from the middle to the left, and then look for the parameters at the end. Like I said, functionally, you can still do the same operations, but now you can make them easier to follow along. This also works for every other function. So previously where you write the function name, open brackets, and then the piece of data that you want to operate on, and then any parameters, you can also take the data and use the dot operator to call the function and then give the parameters, as you see here at the bottom, right? It's the same function A, B as to say A dot function and then give B and the rest of them. like I said, I'll show you lots of examples of this. We're going to use this very heavily, but I just wanted to stand still and say you can do this for the previously existing functions as well. It's not going to be just on our arrays, for example. And then finally, a frequently asked for feature is the ability to add embedded queries. So we can now do JQL inside our formulas, which allows us to make slightly better conditionals. We can do filters. Previously, we'd have to use a query match column, which would give you a list, a column of zeros and ones, depending on if the value is true for the query. And now you can do all of them just in the formulas themselves. And it just makes things a little bit easier. You'd use the JQL keyword, more mustache brackets, and then whatever JQL it is you want to be tracking. Naturally, you can also use SJQL if you are so inclined. I won't go too deeply into SJQL, but it's a great kind of addition or enhancement of the JQL language. That being said, that's really all I wanted to cover from a presentation perspective. Right now, I want to start diving into the examples because I find most of these things are too abstract if we do them just in presentation mode. So let's actually go through and open a structure and add some formulas to this. So the first thing we're going to do, as I mentioned, are user functions. So previously, let me add a formula. And I'm going to expand this just so we can all see this. Hopefully this is zoomed in enough for everybody to see. By all means, send a quick Q&A like, hey, could we enhance the font size if you want? So previously, my colleague Julia had mentioned that we can use the with operator to create local variables, which has been the case in Expr for a while now. And you could say with total story points, and then you can use an operation here. Let's call it the sum of the story points. And then using the colon at the end, it means now going forward, I can use the variable total story points in future references in the function. So especially as you have complex formulas, you can start asking more things. And instead of constantly rewriting simple things or more complex things, you can just refer to them each time. So this works well enough with local variables, but we've now enhanced it. Now you can do not just variables, but functions. And I'll give you two examples here, which I think one will be a kind of a toy example to show you how it works. And then another one will be an example that I think is very useful, especially for those of us that use structure for reporting purposes. So I'm going to make a quick formula function called paren. It will have a variable inside it, a parameter called text. And I'm just going to say this is, basically, I'm going to take the piece of text and I'm going to add parentheses to it. It's very trivial. And I'm just going to use the concat operator like we did before. And let's say text. And now concat again. And then close the parentheses. So now when I use the paren function, I can reference, say, summary. And if all goes well, we can now see the summary in this new column wrapped in parentheses. Now, this is obviously a toy example, not super useful, but it gives you an idea of how the function works. You can pass it any parameter. If I wanted to be cheeky and I wanted to have really short variable names, you could use T and everything still works accordingly, right? This variable is only local to the function definition. So using that, we can actually do a lot of really interesting things. So let me give you a function that I've used and I always hated typing out too much. I'm going to call it colorize. And hopefully you've seen from the last session, but otherwise, one of the things we can do is we can make the text a different color. We can do a lot of cool things with the wiki markup, but right now I'm just going to make the color different. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the text and I'm going to tell it I want it to be a given color, right? So as you can see here, color is one of the variables that I'm passing to this function. S is going to be the string that I turn that particular color. And so while I'm writing this, this piece is all just the text. So this is just the word color. And with the $, this is the variable color. So we can see that here. We could do C and call this, for example, C, but I don't think that that adds too much to the readability. So we're just going to keep it called color. And then the variable S, and then we're going to close this with the word color. So now when I use the function colorize, I can do things like this. So I'm going to borrow the summary again, and I want it to be green. Now the summary is going to be not green yet. And the reason being is this is still just a piece of text. We have to tell it to format to wiki markup, and now it will be green. All right, and I always forget that step, and then it'll show you exactly what happens. And the reason this is helpful, because right now just repeating it and then using it once, that's great. But for example, we can use our if status equals done. And then now we could say, oh, I want to colorize. We'll do the summary just to give you a visual indicator. And I want them to be blue. Else if status equals, let's do in progress, why not? And then we'll do colorize again, summary, and now we're going to make it green. I realize I've switched the traditional Jira colors, but why not? And then for the else statement, we don't have to add an else if you don't want to, but we'll have a default here, and we'll colorize the summary and make it red. And so now what you'll see is we can visually gather the status real quick from the visuals element, right? And I don't have to keep writing, mustache bracket, curly, semicolon, red for the red one, and then the green one and the blue one. So this just allows us to reuse pieces of functionality that we've already defined and created. It's a great way to kind of make your life just a little bit easier.
Hey, Phil, can you expand the box so we can see all the text?
Absolutely, it's a good call.
Thank you.
So I'll try and keep it open this way, this far. So the formula results will be here, and under this will obviously be the summary column that we have. Now, obviously, you want to give this a useful name, right? So status report column is something decent here. And now we have just some color, and visually we can see like, oh, hey, what's the status of the children of this particular epic? And we can see, oh, we've got a bunch of to-dos, one in progress, one done. That's just, again, a toy example, but the functionality expands itself. For most things today, it's not going to be an exhaustive list of all the new features that are available. It's just going to be showing you some highlights, and as well as just how you can access a lot of this. So the next topic I want to talk about are the items and the properties. And to do that, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to click on the help button here, and I'm going to go to our documentation. And I will accept cookies. I love cookies. So the reference documentation for the Expr language will give you a lot of really useful topics that you can cover, and you can dive really deeply. You can see, for example, there's a function reference here, and it'll tell you exactly what the different functions are by topic. So you can see array functions, statistical functions. If you want to work with date and time to durations, there's a whole collection of those that you can then check out what the function name is, what parameters you pass to it, and what will you get in return. The same obviously applies to aggregate functions, which we won't cover today, but they are very, very useful. They allow you to do operations on the whole hierarchy or subparts of the hierarchy. But what we really want to talk about today is the item property reference. And I'm going to leave this open because we're going to come back to this a few times. But basically what's happened is for different types, and you can see all the types of data that we have access to, whether it's an issue itself or the user, the issue links, or things like sprint, we can ask for further properties of that particular item. So for example, if I'm talking about issues, I can ask for the key, the summary, the created date, the reporter, the assignee, all that good stuff. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment. I just wanted to walk through some of the other options. So issue link is one. And you can chain these together just like we did with the function calls before, right? You can ask for the issue links based on a certain parameter. And this allows you to just put together really complex queries with data that is readily accessible to you now. So it's all just a fingertip away. So what does that look like? Well, let's go back to our formula column. I'm going to clear out the status report column. And I want to show you just a simple example, say epic stories, which gives me the stories attached to the epics. And I want their story points. So what happens now is I'm given for every item that has epic stories, which is in this case, obviously just the epics, I'm given their story point values. Now these should correspond to the children under that. So when I add the story points column, we should see that those numbers all line up. Now this is a bit of a toy example, obviously, but we're going to get into arrays to store this data. But I want you to be familiar with the fact that this data is only present when the stories are here. This data is not. So if I go to a different structure with the same set of columns, the same epics, but I didn't bring in the stories to this particular structure, I can still query that attribute or that property of the epics, right? So I can bring the stories in, and I could say, just simply give me the epic stories, which I would do like this. And you'll see I'm getting a series of links to the wiki markups for the piece of text of all the children, all the stories of the epics. And so we can now get a lot more information here without the epics necessarily being part of it. So let me give you two examples, and I want to talk about this just to give you a feel for how this works before we get into more complex ones. As I told you, we have the story points, right? So what if I want the story with the highest value of story points, just to see what's going on? So I type story points, cool. Now I have the list of story points, remember? So if I do max, it's the function that gives me the max value of all those story points. Remember, we had all the stories. I want their epics, I want their story point values, and then I want the max of those, which is great, but now I just have the size of that story, but I want the story with the highest value. So how I can do that is using one of the statistical functions we have called umax by, and then we will tell it what we want it to operate by. So before I finish this, let me just show you where that goes. I'm going to find my function reference. It's a statistical function, and umax by is right here. And it will tell me it works on an array and whatever the parameter is that we want to work with. So it returns the maximum value by comparing all values in the array using the values calculated by calling the $sign. What that means is, because I've changed them, so now I have, instead of umax by epic stories and the value, I did epic stories.umax. Remember, the chaining of the dot function makes this easier. I want for each element, and that's what the $sign basically tells you, this is what we're doing with each element, I want their story points value. So what this basically does is now it gives you the story with the highest story point value, right? This is just telling us this is what I want you to use as the discriminator for the maximum value. So I've got 16, 6, and 3. And I can change this, obviously, right? Any issue, attribute, or property that I want to work with. So things like priority. Maybe I want to look at the story with the highest priority. And so I'd save that. And now I'm obviously getting slightly different results. And we can do all this on the fly at the same time as we were doing before. You can see, obviously, that these things will call this regardless of whether the stories are here, which I think is super helpful. Now, we've already kind of snuck into the array section here. I want to talk a little bit about the arrays as a abstract concept, because previously all you could do was get a single value, right? We could query the story points, and that's a number, but we couldn't ask for like, hey, I want all of the story points associated with it, and then I want to do operations on that. An array is a data structure that allows us to just hold multiple items in it. And then we can do operations on those arrays. And we're going to do some really cool things in a minute. But it can be complicated. It can be as simple as we want. So let me go back to my epic stories in this case. And instead of doing it by epic stories, instead of asking for the story points, I want the assignees, right? And you can see I can ask for the dot operator and then just get the list. And what's interesting is here now I've got Albert, and I thought I had multiple stories under this, right? So let's go back to the full list of the same epics. And it turns out, I'm going to remove the story points column and add the assignees just so we can make sure we're on the same page. These are empty values, so they're not here to operate on. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that the array can be populated with all the assignees, obviously. But if there's no assignee to populate, you need to keep track of that. And that's just one little caveat when working with the arrays. Don't assume that all the values exist, because if you have just one value, it's happy to do whatever operations you ask it on that. So let's talk about manipulating the arrays, because I think that that's where a lot of the power of this functionality comes from. And I want to give you one somewhat advanced example and one actually very complicated, not really complicated formula, because it's a really simple ask, but it takes a couple steps to get there. And I want to walk you through each step to build that, because I think that that's going to be very helpful as you go back and try to build these on your own. So let's start with the work logs. So each item here has work logs or doesn't. So in the case that they do, we'll see the assignee or the person who logged the work and the amount of work that's been logged. And we can see 4 hours, 6 hours, 6 hours. And in this particular story, I see 2 people have logged work against this particular assignee, against this particular story. And if I were to just pull in the work log column and say, hey, just show me all the work that's been logged on this particular issue, I would just get the sum totals. And in the cases 4, 6, 6 here, it doesn't really matter, right? It's probably the person doing the work. But here, where I have 7 hours worth of work logged by Bob and 5 by Mr. Reynolds, which is the admin in this case, I'd get 12, but I didn't know who wrote or who did what. And naively assuming that all this is the same person can lead us into, well, a stray, I guess. Let me change this back to our generic formulas. So what am I going to do here? Well, I'm going to filter, because that's one of the main operations that I can do on these arrays. And I want to filter by the situation where the author of the work log, so remember, this is for each work log in this array, is not the same person as the assignee of that particular issue. And so when I save this, you can now see, all right, admin didn't log any work on these, but they are the assignee for this particular issue, but Bob has logged the work here. So let me pull in our assignee column real quick just to confirm they are indeed M. Reynolds is the assignee here and not here. And just to quickly show you that this stuff all operates in real time, if I reassign this to Mr. Reynolds, the formula will update automatically, and now it'll hide because it no longer passes that filter criteria. Well, let's go back here, because I didn't just care about the assignee. What I really cared about was the time being spent by non-assignee people. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to pair 2 other operations to this particular formula column. I'm going to perform a map operation and then a reduce operation. And what that basically does is it's another way to manipulate the array. Map will tell me, hey, I want these parts of the array, and then reduce will tell me, or I will tell it basically through the reduce function, how I want to take this array of multiple values and bring it down into a single value. So what does that actually look like? Well, map works as follows. I give it a variable, and that variable is basically every work log item in this particular array. After it passes the filter, I want you to give me the time spent aspect of it. And we can go back here. Remember telling you item properties. We're going to go to work logs because those are the items we each have. And I can query by, the author, when it was last updated, all that stuff. But I'm really interested in the time spent. So I've got that here. But before I go into that, because that just gives me the same as time spent here, I want to reduce. So what I'm going to do is reduce this array by adding them together. And the way I do this again is by giving it the tuple, which is just a pair of variables here. And I'm going to tell it, well, and if you have multiple items, I want you to take them and add them together. That is it. And so this looks a little complicated, but essentially what happens is I'm going to take all the work logs, I'm going to filter them by this criteria, right? So I want to know where the author of the work log is different than the assignee of that row, so that particular issue. Then I'm going to be talking from now on about the time spent aspect of it, not just the work logs as a whole. And then I want you to take all those individual values and add them together. And that gives us these large numbers. The reason we're getting these large numbers is that the database stores all these work logs in milliseconds. And so instead of saying, I want to multiply this by some very large number, we could format this back into date, time, duration, whichever we need. In this case, we need a duration, so we can get 6 hours and 7 hours. So this was it's a relatively complicated formula, but it hopefully walks you through the different ways we can manipulate our arrays. We can add filter steps, we can add map steps, we can add reduce steps. Just to make things a little bit easier, we can put them on separate lines so they again become a little bit easier to read, right? So we can see this happens, then this happens. And this allows us, especially when debugging or creating new formulas, to really just go through it step by step and hold in our mind roughly what the data structure is that we're looking at. I'm got a collection of work logs. I'm going to filter it. So I still have a collection of work logs, but they are usually smaller. Now I'm going to change this from a collection of work logs to a collection of time spent attached to that. And then I'm going to take all of them and squish them into a single variable, or sorry, a single result, which is what we see here. And so that's roughly how I want to walk through this. This is the thinking behind manipulating these arrays and using them to create really interesting and complex queries. So let me walk you through one more. That's a question we actually get asked a lot in terms of use case functionality that I want to show you. So let me hide this because the real estate's at a premium here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through the issue links, because the question is very simple. I want to see all the items that are blocking my items, my issues, right? So in this particular structure, I have a set scope of work. I have 3 epics and a bunch of stories. And what I'm really interested in is knowing, like, hey, what's the status of the blockers of these stories? Because that way I can figure out, like, hey, should I plan this sprint, or maybe I should go talk to someone because I need to do it now. There are a lot of reasons we'd want to track these blockers. And previously, the way we would do that is we could either put them on the Gantt chart and look at them that way. But what we really needed to do was we needed to bring them into the structure. We would need to add, for example, an extend operator and add all the blockers here. But the problem there is that it messes up everything else, right? If I had a summation of story points or time logs or something along those lines, that now gets kind of screwy because we've added the blockers as children to the story. So we can now solve that in a different way. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say, hey, I want all these issue links that are attached to this particular issue. You can see we've got a whole bunch of them here. Some of them don't have any, that's fine, right? But some of them have several. And at the moment, what's happening is that there's no difference being made, or no discernible difference between the blocker and the blockee, or the blocked item. But also, we haven't yet done anything about saying, well, what about other issue links, right? There's starts at the same time, there's clones, there's a whole bunch of other possibilities. Well, good thing I showed you the example where we would filter those out. So in this case, I'm going to pretend I forgot how this works, and I'm going to look at my documentation, and we're going to look at the issue link. And I want to know what elements I have available. So I've got source, destination, sequence, and type. In this particular instance, I'm really interested in the type because I want to narrow it down to the blocking links. We can see at the bottom, that gives me the link type, name, inward, outward style. Awesome. So I know that I want to filter by each issue link's type. And I want them to be blocks because that's the name of this particular issue link that I'm looking at. And so now you'll see we have the same, or roughly the same list. We have to do one more step. We have to filter by the blocking items, right? And we can do that in 2 ways. We can look at the issue link and say, I want everything that the destination, remember each link has a destination and a source, where the destination is this issue, or where the source is not this issue, right? Because if A blocks B, what I'm interested in this case is all the A's related to the B that I have. So again, I'm going to create a new line because I know this is going to get a little bit bigger. So I'm going to filter all the resulting issue links that I get after this filter step by, let's do it by the destination. I think it's easier to work with the positive than the negative. So where the destination is this particular issue, right? So now we should see a lot of these drop, because what I've done is I've only asked for the blocking links where the destination is in this particular structure, right? So 16, 15, 17 all line up. We can see here that 6 blocks 8. And since 6 is also in this particular structure, before that step, we had the same link here, right? They're both attached to it. So this allows us to filter by the links and which ones are on what side. And so if I want to just remember where I'm at, so this only keeps the issues that are blocking the current issue. Right, you can add these double slashes to add some comments, excuse me, comments to your formulas. You can also use this to comment out sections of the formula, which is really useful, but we'll get to that again in just a bit. I want to do one final step. What I'm also interested in here is just, I don't want the whole link. Like, it's basically superfluous to keep adding, hey, this is 16, this is 15, because that we already have that, right? So we're going to go over here and I want to say, just give me the source, right? So we have the array, we filtered by all the blocking ones. So the array of issue links, I only want the blocks links. I only want the ones where it's blocking my current issue. And then I want the source, right? I want the other thing. And we could flip this around, right? We could say source not equals not this, for example. But right now, this should now simplify this to all of the blocking items. Okay, cool. We've made some progress. This is actually quite helpful. I want to add one more step, and I want to add it somewhere in the middle, because what I care about these things if they're blocking my issue, right? But it's quite possible that these things aren't really blocking my issues. I don't want to delete the link if this particular issue is done, but I do want it to stay. So I want the link to stay in Jira, but I don't want it to show up here, right? Because if the issue in question is done, it's not really blocking. It's just, you know, there was a blocking relationship. So how we're going to do that is we're going to add another filter step. And you can see filter is probably going to be the one you use a lot. And in this particular case, I need to look at the item that is blocking us, which is the source in this particular issue link. And I want to make sure that they are not done, right? Because whether they're in to-do or in progress, it really doesn't matter too much to me, because they're not done, therefore they're still blocking us. And if you obviously want to be more specific, you can, but I'm going to take the source for each of the items. That's what the $sign, remember, tells us. We're doing that for each item here. And using our item properties, I can query the status of that particular issue. And in this case, like I said, all I care about is that it's not done. Close quote. And so when I save this, a few of them have dropped away. Obviously, TTY number 1, which is completed. We can see that with the resolution column here. Several of those aren't. So I've managed to take quite a bit of data that didn't otherwise exist in this structure and do some operations in terms of filtering by and operating on it to get new data, new information that has become much more actionable. And if I wanted, I could obviously add some custom formula like a user function, like the colorize one I did, for example, and I can highlight them differently. So for example, I could say, well, hey, if it's in progress, you can make it green. And if they're not already in progress, then make them red. So we can see how severely the blocking it is. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you today. There's a whole lot of operations we can do on these arrays. Filter, map, and reduce in particular. And we can then basically take all these things. And as long as they line up with the question we're trying to answer here, we're going to be getting useful results. And we can get, like I said, so much more, because as you can tell from the item properties that are available, we have, for the issue alone, a lot of issues we can pull in. But we also have a lot of other stuff related to sprints, to versions, to components. And so if I wanted to query those things, they're all just literally a formula column away, right? So we can add for the sprints, but I want the sprint start dates, for example. Well, give me sprint start dates. And now I can see, if I set the correct formulation, when each sprint is supposed to start. And so now, instead of having to do complex things like tracking the due date with the sprint and making sure I name the sprint based on the date, I can just say, hey, right now, give me all the sprints that have a start date that is after this issue's due date. And so now each one, again, changing the format, is going to give me a 0 in the case that that's not the case. And I got 1s here where I have sprints scheduled to start after the issue due date, which means obviously something's not gone quite according to plan. And we can do this in a lot of different ways. We can do this not just by the sprints, but we can also go by fixed versions, right? So let me take one step back. I can query the fixed version start date and the end dates. And again, we'll have to go back and forth with the formulas, or sorry, the formats, because in this case, it's the date time that I'm looking at. And this is one of those caveats, and I stepped here because I wanted to show this real quick. The results of a lot of these questions that we have, so for example, for fixed versions, the fixed versions attached to an issue, if I scroll down and find them, fixed versions gives me an array of versions, which is an important distinction to make and something I wanted to highlight here. And that's because it's quite possible for an issue to be inside multiple fixed versions, just like it's possible for an issue to be attached to multiple sprints. Right? If you assign it to work on the sprint, we don't get it done, we close the sprint, we kick it to the next one, it's still been associated with that other sprint. And Jira does track these things. So in order to handle those things correctly, Structure will give you the full array of every fixed version that's attached to it. And so what you'll want to do there is either you could add a max function, right? So give me the latest start date that I can assume is then the latest fixed version. And then I can perform operations on that. Another thing that I think is worth highlighting before I walk over to the Q&A section is the fact that well, Structure is very smart. We have some very smart developers working on it and a really smart QA team that catch most of the bugs. For arrays, if there's only one element in the array, you can just perform any action on it as if you were just operating on that element, right? So if you have, if you're asking stuff like fixed version, you want the start date, and there's only one particular item in there, it'll just give you the full thing as opposed to a comma separated value with, no items but one. So these are just the things we can do, the operations we can perform on these particular issues. Like I said, there's just a lot of them that you can kind of play with and explore. I know friend Joseph is in the audience right now, and they've been working with components to track certain things. So I can track, for example, the component lead assigned to this, and I got to make sure that this is the general version, and we can see who's working or who's the lead for which component, and we can make sure that, well, I don't want to see the username, give me their email addresses. Right, so all these things are now literally a dot away, and so this is really where a lot of the superpowers are coming from with the new release of Expr. You can say, oh, I want this item, and then I want this property attached to that item, and then query it or add it to a conditional or perform operations on it. And this is, for those of you that have been using formulas, probably an interesting, like, oh my God, the possibilities are so huge, at least I hope so, that it just allows you to do so much more. And so our what's it called, our documentation is complete. It'll tell you everything you can do, what you can query and what you'll get back, whether it's text or just a Boolean, which is the 0 or 1 for true false, and you can track things. And we could probably spend a whole other bootcamp session talking about, for example, how we can update the comments and track those. But I actually just wanted to leave it here right now because I think it's really useful. A lot of you probably have gotten a lot of stuff to think about. I saw a few questions come in, so let's actually open it up to questions. So I can either pull it up here, Q&A section, and hand it back to Nick, and we can do them live if they're not too difficult. So Nick.
Yeah, so this is a question. I think you were talking about the array edge cases. Could you maybe at some point later expand on the array caveat thing that you briefly mentioned? I'm not entirely sure what they're asking about, but I figured I'd try.
Ooh, there's a few caveats in the things that I talked about today. So let me see if I can hit them. So one caveat with the user function, for example, is that you can't use functions that already exist, right? So max is not one that you can create a new one for. A caveat with the item properties is that you can access a lot of them. You can access custom fields as well. You just got to reference them correctly. And the documentation is probably the way to go in terms of, all right, here's the example, here's how it tracks. I can't really walk through every possible example. Some of the caveats with the arrays, there's going to be a few of them, really. I can't remember, to be honest with you, which one I was going to talk about. There's obviously going to be performance that you'll need to keep in mind, because let me go back to my demo. Just because the issue isn't in the structure obviously does mean we're still querying it. So that's a potential slowness. You should be mindful of, basically, if an item doesn't exist, it won't be added to the array. So there'll be an array. Let me just pull that one up, actually. Let me show you. So let me give you the epic stories and their assignees, right? Just real quick. So this is an array at the epic level of assignees. And you'll see duplicates when there are duplicates, right? Because the array is not in any order. There's no guarantee that that's going to be the same order all the time. They're not going to be in alphabetical order necessarily. They're not going to be in ascending order of story points or whatever until you explicitly tell it, like, hey, I want you to give me the highest story point value, right? Or the lowest story point value. That's also an option. One of the main caveats that I think you should be mindful of is the fact that it won't tell you in any way if this is everything, right? So I asked for the assignees for the epic stories. There are 4 stories under this epic, but either they're all assigned to Albert, or some of them are unassigned, as you can see here. And the array, or the formula column, doesn't care. It assumes that what you're asking for is exactly known. So if I have another one assigned to Albert, the array will add another Albert. But if it's unassigned, it's not going to add empty places. So operations that are being performed on incomplete data sets will happily just perform on incomplete data sets, right? So you should either in your functions, in your formulas, you should make sure that the length of the array is the exact size of the amount of children that you have here, for example, or you should have something else in place that makes sure that this is not a possible error situation that you're going to run into, right? Because you can have incomplete arrays and it will happily perform operations on it. So empty story point values, sprints, for example, if you don't have a start date assigned to the sprint, it's not going to give you one, right? It can't guess that. So it's that, I think, that's important because it will happily perform further operations on incomplete data.
Yeah, so this is a paragraph-sized question, so get ready for this one. Could we use this approach to, for instance, find the total number of points that are dependent on an upper level item in a particular workflow state through multiple levels of hierarchy? I realize this might be a little bit too complex, but just curious if this would be possible. Sorry, I think you're muted, Phil.
All right, I said it was an excellent question and a lot of nice things about the person asking. I think actually, so off the top of my head, there's nothing that I've heard that shouldn't be doable, right? So there's a high likelihood we can do it. Whether I can do it right now, live on the spot with this particular data set, probably not. So what we'll end up doing, and we'll do this with all the questions that we can't answer either live or just don't get to, is we'll send you an email, nice anonymous user, with a walkthrough of whether that's possible or not. I think it should be. A lot of it will depend, obviously, on specifics of, well, what's your definition of dependent and across the hierarchy? Because we can query an item's parent, we can query an item's children in the hierarchy. We can query their status in the workflow. We can check through links as well. So each individual section we can do, and it probably makes sense to see like, hey, let's walk through it, like I did with the example with the filtering the blocks, where you would just, we know where the destination is, we know which steps we want to take, so let's incrementally take one step with the formula that we're writing, and then see if we either miss one, in which case we'd love to hear about it, because if the use case isn't covered, then we can add it to our backlog, or we can work our way there. And if we run into some challenges with the issues or with the formula, let us know by all means. But it should be possible. I just probably can't show it to you right now.
All right. This is a nice little quality of life one. How do we make those issue keys into clickable links in the issue links filter example?
That's a good one. So basically, so these are pieces of text. If I go to wiki markup, it does the same thing as you would if you link the item in Confluence or somewhere else. It becomes a clickable link. Now, one thing I do want to mention is if I click a link here, it gives me the issue details on the right. If I click the link, the resizing screen, I'm too fast. If I click the link here, it will send me to the issue page itself. So we're taking it away from structure, which is fine, obviously, but it's just something to be aware of. If you're in the middle of trying something out real quick, it's going to kick you to a different page. But yeah, so ticking the wiki markup, it does a lot of really cool stuff. It'll also, for example, strike through if the item's already been completed. So 15 we can see has been resolved. So that's really cool. But yeah, that's how you make them clickable links.
We've got a little more of a troubleshooting question here. We have story points that have issue links. But when I call issue links, I don't see anything in structure. Why do you think it is like that? What could be the reason?
Well, hold on, we have story points that have issue links, which is
so basically, I think you have a
stories.
formula that's just the word issue links that's not working. So the first thing I would check would probably be the version.
Yes. So obviously this has been, if you type this out, it will give you all the links. Now, the first thing you'll want to do, obviously, is to verify that those links exist. I'm assuming that they've done that. You can check through the issue details or where else. You can see issue links. The second thing would be, indeed, I would check the version. You can track that through click the information at the bottom right here. It will tell you what version of structure you're using. 7.2 right now is the latest version. So if you aren't on 7.0, you won't be able to have that, obviously. The big launch of Expr 2.0 was tied to structure 7. We've done some additions or supplements to the formulas in the meantime. So if you get to 7.2, you can do a little bit more than you can do with 7.0. But those would be the first two things I'd check, especially if it's already missed or if it's already giving you errors here. The other actual thing to check, and we probably should have mentioned this earlier, is the fact that structure does its level best, and it's very good at it, to try and guess what you mean by a variable, right? So if I type issue links, it will create that as a variable, and it will try and link that to the issue links. It's possible that there might be a field that conflicts with that, or it just didn't guess right. If, for example, if I want to use SP for story points, there's no way it's going to guess that. It's going to say like, well, there's a variable here and I don't know what this is. And in order to solve that is you would go click on it and then basically tell it what you want to use. So you can reference another formula column, or in this case, I would just say, hey, give me these story points. And now I've mapped the SP variable to the story points. And so that's another possible thing. Sometimes it guesses wrong. Sometimes there's a conflict in the naming. So you might have a field called issue links or someone else in a different project. So those would be the two places I'd look first.
Yeah, so our next one is, are all script runner JQL functions compatible with structure and formulas, or are there any known incompatibilities?
The script runner function, that's interesting. There are some limitations to what you can do. I would probably double check with our QA team before I blanket say, yeah, it'll work with all of those. For example, the was keyword doesn't work very well in inline JQL just because of, well, was is an operation that Jira doesn't enjoy doing. So there are some limitations. So it's not going to be everything works right out the box right away. In particular with the script runner functions, we should probably test those. So I can't guarantee for sure. But it's possible they'll work. We should probably check. This is going to be
Okay.
one of those. I'll
We'll
let you know.
double check on
I
that
don't
one.
know. Yeah.
And then, yeah, kind of a follow-up question actually about the nulls you were talking about in arrays. Could a formula replace null with some known or unknown values? The nulls are obvious, so we can deal with those missing values and know we're missing something.
Ooh, that would depend on how you want to do it. So basically, you can't do it post creation of the array. So if I go back to my epic stories, because that's just a convenient array that I can always pull up, and the assignee, right? So this is the one where we have some missing ones. I can't go in to this array and then say like, hey, I want you to add null values to this, right? Because this has already been set as an array of a certain length. What you can do though is in the creation process, you can basically track the length of this particular array. All right, so we can go here and track, actually this will be in the language reference, but we can call different operations on the array itself, right? So we can do like dot size. I believe it's dot size. Let's see if I'm right. There we go. It's nice when they work real time. And I can, for example, if, let me write it correctly, if epic story size is not the same as the epic stories size, then, in this case, just give me the O, but we're going to see a lot of O's, right? But you can see here, for example, in this particular epic, there is no O because they do line up correctly. This one has a missing one. This one has a missing one as well. Now, obviously, you would step through this in a slightly more structured fashion, right? So we'll see, well, what's the difference? Well, you can obviously query the difference by saying, well, give me the difference between the full size and this array size. And then you can add to the array that amount of null values or whatever it is. The tricky thing here is you can't really add null values as such. So from a programming speak, I can't say null. So null. But what you could do is you could add phantom values to replace it. So for example, if I were to work with this particular array, right? So I'm going to do this on the fly, see if this works. Diff. I want to create an array, which I can do with the array function, and I would have the array that I do want, right? So that's the epic story assignee, and then I would add to those X amount of times, which is the amount of the difference in this particular case, right? So the difference between epic story size and epic stories assignee size, I would add that many, just the text unassigned, for example, right? So that would be how you would get that array. So I'd have to look up exactly how that works because, but that's the operation that you would be performing, right? So you would fill it in. So you can't do the blank ones because the empty strings will be just getting removed, but you can add the word unassigned and then get an array that says unassigned, 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 Albert, Albert, for example. And then you'll have one the same length as the one you want to work with. Good question, though. That one stumped me.
Yeah, that was a good one. We're actually a minute past the hour here, so I think we're gonna have to wrap up and say goodbye. We do have some more questions in the chat. As I said before, we will send those answers out, as well with the recording and the slides and all that other information. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us for our second section. And yeah, we'll have the option to submit questions for our next Q&A session. I think our next session will be almost entirely Q&A. So we'd love to get your questions, and we'll try to answer all of them.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Bye.